excited as I am about this panel. I'm looking forward to it. See some few new faces out there. How many of you out there, this is your first event at the Texas Public Policy Foundation? All right. Wow. Okay. Just a few. I almost thought I saw like one of our staff raise their hands. And I wondered, what? Really? Yeah, I guess it could be your first event if you're a staffer, right? Excellent. Well, unfortunately, I walked up here a little too soon, and Clint, our VP of events, is a stickler for everything by the book, as he should be. So we're going to start right on the button. But all right. Oh, look at that. Have we always had that device that even has the temperature on it? Are you kidding me? It's enough to make you, like, sweat if it's out of a comfortable range. And the theater empties. Have a different chimes this time? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chuck DeVore. I'm the Chief National Initiatives Officer for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Welcome to our panel, The Coming Storm, the Threat that China Poses to the U.S. and Texas. I think we have a wonderful panel this evening. I'd like to introduce them to you before we start. We'll begin with the Honorable Doug Ducey. He's the former governor of Arizona. He is known as one of America's most successful entrepreneurs and governors. He began his career in business with Procter & Gamble and later served as CEO of something that I'm sure a few of you, especially if you have children or grandchildren, have been to, the Cold Stone Creamery. I know I've been there. How many of you have been to Cold Stone Creamery? Yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah. Ducey was elected as Arizona's 23rd governor in 2014 and then re-elected in 2018. During this time, he was known for pioneering education scholarship accounts, something that we've been trying to do in Texas for a good long time, as well as universal school choice. He also served as chairman of the Republican Governors Association and is a passionate Arizona State Sun Devil. Okay, now, I'm not sure how well that goes in this crowd, but that's okay. We have choice in this country. All right, Alex Gray, the founder and CEO of American Global Strategies. He's the former chief of staff to former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Alex Gray is the founder and CEO of American Global Strategies. He most recently served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff to the White House National Security Council. He previously served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President for the Defense Industrial Base and, at the National Economic Council, and is the first ever Director for Oceania and the Indo-Pacific Security at the NSC. He's a graduate of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, receiving his BA in International Affairs, and attended, it gets worse, people, Oklahoma State University. Yeah, I can't help you there, but, if anyone gets aggressive, I will attempt to say, yeah, I'll do that for you. Michael Lucci, he's the founder and CEO of State Armor. Lucci created State Armor to develop and enact state solutions to global security threats. At State Armor, he synthesizes a unique understanding of global affairs with deep experience in state policy making and works with both state and federal leaders. He has worked in state policy and politics for more than a decade. He has been a senior policy advisor to the State Policy Network and a senior tax advisor to the Platt Institute. He's also a proud graduate of the University of Notre Dame. All right. You've got a few of them out there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this panel started. So something I'm really curious about, given the important nature of governors in our federal system, is when you became governor in 2014 and then was sworn into office, presumably you had a few months, were you in a transition period, were you ever given any sort of a national security briefing by the FBI as to the potential threat, as to how potentially hostile forces operate? And by that I mean the Chinese Communist Party or United Front groups or things like that? Or was that just something that you had to kind of learn on the fly?
Well, First, Chuck, let me say thank you. It's great here to be at the Texas Public Policy Institute. I serve on the board of Goldwater Institute in Arizona, and we love a lot of the great ideas you export here and work very hard to keep up with the good things coming out of this place and the fine people that it houses. I was, as governor, given several security briefings that were from the FBI, and if I recall correctly, the Department of Defense was involved as well. But the subject of China didn't come up. It was more around infrastructure projects in the state that were vulnerable and in need of protection.
So, toss this one to Michael or to Alex, or maybe both of you. I recall during the latter part of the Trump administration when I think at the time Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, and he put out a pretty stark warning to governors that they needed to be on the alert. Is this too little, too late? What was the nature of what he warned at the time? As I recall, it was, late 2019 that happened?
Well, and thanks for having me, Chuck. And I will say, Governor, one of the most, you hosted Ambassador O'Brien in Phoenix in 2019 when he gave one of the most significant speeches that I think any national security advisor had ever given on China. And that was done in Phoenix, and that was a huge moment for the administration in terms of our China policy. So thank you for that. Look, Chuck, I think we have had 30 years of opportunity to warn about this threat. Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien and the entire leadership team in the Trump administration, from the president on down, stepped in and were forward-leaning on it in a way that no predecessor ever had been. But we're 30 years too late. And the biggest challenge, and we saw this within the US government at the federal level, was convincing a large swath of the federal bureaucracy that China was a threat. And it took till the end of the Trump administration to really begin moving the needle in a tangible way. So what Michael is doing with state armor and what we're now seeing governors do all across the country, this is a belated reaction, an important one, but we're behind the threat, unfortunately.
Michael, what keeps you up at night in this vein? I mean, if you could keep the list a little short, maybe.
Chuck, there are a number of issue areas that we build state solutions. So influence operations, supply chains of freedom. But I would say that the thing that would keep me up is vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure within the United States. My understanding, as someone who has not held a security clearance, is that we are aware of ongoing, iterative, broad, and massive operations to be able to create the capacity to shut down critical infrastructure, water, electric, the things that make everyday life possible that we have always just taken for granted because we have this fantastic wealth-generating machine, which is the United States of America, that they are creating the capacity to shut down those providers of everyday life, primarily through cyber attackability. And you see Volt Typhoon. Here in Texas, we've had several headlines about water infrastructure being directly infiltrated, I believe by Chinese and Russian actors. So I think that is the main thing that keeps me up at night. And if I can make it a bit gloomier, the reason why they would want to shut that down, I mean, in many ways, America is the biggest customer to China, right? They don't want to annoy their number one customer unless they're doing something to sort of shift the global power situation by conducting an attack in the Indo-Pacific region. Then they want to shut things off here so that we cannot project power abroad because we have such dysfunction here. So that's the attempts to infiltrate, and some of them I believe have been successful to some extent, our critical infrastructure to create the capacity to shut down normal American life. That's what keeps me up.
So, Alex, Michael just used a term of art that virtually no one in here knows about. Maybe you can explain it. What is Volt Typhoon? It kind of sounds almost like a James Bondian sort of thing. What is that?
Well, Michael's probably more expert in than I am. I'll let him do it. But I will say one thing I think of note. Michael mentioned the vulnerability that we have domestically as a consequence of China's ambitions in the Western Pacific. I think this is something that people need to appreciate because it's so ahistorical since the end of the Cold War. This is so out of the American experience since the Berlin Wall came down. The idea that we are going to have repercussions in the homeland, in the continental United States, for far-flung overseas geopolitics, that we're going to have to deal with the consequences of foreign wars. And I think this is something that the American people hopefully saw a small taste of during COVID, saw the way the Chinese used the pharmaceutical supply chain as a weapon, but imagine it 100-fold. Imagine not just supply chains, but imagine cyber attacks, imagine critical infrastructure attacks, imagine use of drones, imagine very well-embedded malign actors at the municipal, county, state, national level coming and doing things at the homeland that we usually consign to science fiction books. This is the reality that we're facing in a competition that is unlike any we've ever faced. And this is what I think Michael and his organization are trying to warn us about, is that we are not invulnerable, one, as a country at home, and we're not invulnerable at the state, county, local level. This is a threat very different from what we faced before.
All right, 30 seconds on Volt Typhoon.
It's a massive cyber attack program to infiltrate routers, computers, and software that governs our critical infrastructure so that they would have the capacity to take it down. And this is an ongoing campaign. So the FBI has rooted out some of it, but the FBI also has publicly said, like, this is ongoing. And one last thing I would say about it is previous iterations of cyber attacks upon the United States would be to do something ambitious like steal the plans for the F-35. Super important for a power to try to get that from the United States. What the federal authorities are saying now is there seems to be no goal of intellectual property theft. They are pre-positioning essentially what Congressman Mike Gallagher said. Essentially, it's like putting bombs on a bridge. You don't put bombs on a bridge to steal from someone crossing the bridge. You put bombs on the bridge to blow up the bridge. So that's what Volt Typhoon is in the cyber world. It's the ability to launch a massive attack. Chris Wray, the director of FBI, has said they have 50 hackers for every one FBI employee working to counter those hackers. So that's Volt Typhoon in a nutshell.
One of the things that all of you can do, very simple thing to protect yourself as well as not have your own router be inadvertently be part of the system, is occasionally turn it off for 10 seconds, like maybe once a month, let it restart, all right? If you don't do that, you could be inadvertently hosting some of the software on your own home router, which would turn your router, by the way, into a weapon. So, Governor Ducey, the border. You may have been noticing, I know you took firm efforts when you were governor to try to stem the tide of illegal immigration. There's a different governor there now that seems to have a position more in line with that of perhaps Governor Gavin Newsom. And now we're beginning to see a shift in illegal immigration from Texas to the states to the west because Texas is successfully cracking down. And we've seen this 4,000 or 5,000% increase in the number of illegal immigrants coming from the People's Republic of China. When you see that, what kind of goes through your mind when you see this massive increase in illegal immigration, mostly by the way of military-age individuals?
Grave concern. When I ran for governor in 2014, the border was not a national issue. It was a state issue, and it was something that Texas and Arizona had to deal with. And Greg Abbott was very much my partner in bringing the Republican Governors Association together for what we called the American Governors Border Strike Force, where people sent assets and law enforcement leaders and resources to help us stem the tide. And of course, we had a partner in the Trump-Pence administration to do that. I served alongside 3 presidents as governor, and Barack Obama was dramatically better than what Joe Biden is doing. I mean, our southern border is wide open and unprotected, and I don't think that's news to anyone here. You've seen the efforts that Greg Abbott has done to stem the tide. So even if Texas is protected, the rest of the country is vulnerable. These people walk several hundred miles further. These cartels are the worst people in the world and incredibly good at what they do. They are now in charge of border policy, and I think it's been lost very much on the national press. If you remember the first Democratic debates for president, the question was, will you offer free health care to people that cross the border illegally? And every Democrat on that stage, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, raised their hand yes. Well, that video is on every cartel operative's phone. They show everyone in South and Central America to please give them their life savings, and if they can get 1 foot across the border and claim asylum with the proper script, they're in. Well, that news has traveled not only throughout the Americas, but now obviously around the world. I think it's up to 130 countries have now crossed that border, and it's a very real issue. It's been mitigated by some other issues in the past midterm, but I think that this presidential campaign will be fought on that very rock-solid ground for Republicans.
Alex and Michael, let's explore that a little bit more about the nature of the illegal immigration from China that we're seeing. Our sources on the border here at the Foundation alerted us to a dramatic change in the nature of the immigration beginning in January 2023, where it went from family units, often older individuals, who in the rare times they actually were questioned by the Border Patrol or by Customs would say, you know, what they wanted to do when they came to America, where they wanted to go. Now you see, like a light switch, huge increased numbers. You see mostly military-age males. They don't want to talk to Border Patrol. They just want to go on their way, and they disappear into the interior. When you see that, what do you think? What is going on here? Are these just young people fleeing the terrible economic conditions of Xi Jinping's China? Or are these individuals who are caught up in this human trafficking where they're working at these illegal marijuana grows and distributions with the snakehead criminal cartel network? Or might there be something more sinister going on here?
So I would take as a starting point with respect to China's communist regime, what do we know for sure they do at our border? They traffic enough fentanyl to kill 100,000, well, 100,000 Americans a year are murdered by poison intentionally manufactured in China. Some of it has been offshored to Mexico to make a workaround. That comes across the border. That's done knowingly. We just had hearings on Capitol Hill in the last month where, you know, Attorney General Barr, folks on both sides said they knowingly do this. It's a state-owned company that makes this poison, sends it, kills babies in America. That's what they do out in the open. So, okay, so if you put yourself in their shoes, if I put myself in their shoes, if you look and you see the United States of America is just gonna wave through everyone who wants to come across, wouldn't you put a forward deployment across the border? That's not to say, I mean, I would assume most of these people are fleeing some sort of hardship, but that's why you have a border, to separate those who are fleeing hardship from those who are forward deployment. I mean, for a regime that puts all that fentanyl across our border, why would they not put a forward deployment across our border? It would just seem automatic to me that that's how the regime would act. That's not to say that every Chinese person coming across the border, many of them are probably fleeing the communist regime, but you have a border so you could separate those two groups.
I mean, Chuck, you know this from your intelligence background. What does the CCP spend most of its time doing? It's doing a weakness analysis of the United States. It's evaluating our strengths and our weaknesses, and then looking at their comparative strengths and weaknesses and making assessments about where can they exploit vulnerabilities most effectively at cost. And right now, the place where they can most effectively at cost exploit a tremendous American weakness is at the southern border. Do they want to do it for fentanyl purposes? Do they want to do it for narcotics purposes? Do they want to do it for potential kinetic contingencies in the event of a Taiwan scenario? Do they want to do it because there's a potential, we've seen numerous CCP operatives arrested outside of military bases? All of the above. They want to give themselves the optionality to have a presence. Michael called it a forward deployment. I think that's as good a term as any. They want to have the optionality to do a number of scenarios because they have identified an American weakness and they have figured out that it is in their interest to exploit it, and they're going to do it ruthlessly across any number of vectors.
I'd like to shift gears just a little bit to the topic of elite capture. As some of you may know, when I served in the legislature in California, there was this instance where we had a bill up. It was called Tibet Day. It was patterned after a bill that successfully passed in the U.S. House of Representatives with Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, because she has been pretty consistent on that issue. The first year, it was weakened by the Democrats, taken from the Republican, given to a Democrat, and it passed. The second year it came up, the Republican original author wanted to try to keep it pure and have it go all the way through. And what was very interesting was you started to see this unprecedented full court press by the Chinese Foreign Ministry with personnel from the San Francisco consulate and the Los Angeles consulate descending on the capital of Sacramento to lobby people not to vote for the bill, and doing things like offering them trips to Shanghai, trips to Beijing. Let's go to Hong Kong. Let's have a trade delegation. Come to our party in San Francisco. And I'll be darned, the bill died. The bill was killed. I was visited by an agent of the FBI in the middle of this saying, have you been visited yet? And I hadn't. They may have done their homework and knew that it was a waste of time. But that supposedly was like the first time that that happened in America, and that was around 2008. So is that the way elite capture works, or are there other mechanisms by which, and what exactly is elite capture? I'll leave it to any of the three of you to start on that.
I'll start. Just a half step back. The way that the Chinese regime approaches warfare, think of it as a spectrum. So elite capture is a part of that spectrum. The hottest part of the spectrum is, of course, kinetic warfare. And that's not where we're at right now. And then there's, fentanyl and all these other things. Elite capture, like, candidly, I think that they have been tremendously successful for their own purposes. Elite capture is investing in Hollywood. The last movie I know of that did a negative portrayal of Chinese government officials was The Departed. If you recall, there was the scene where the Irish mafia is selling fake chips to the Chinese, these Chinese mafia guys. That's 2005 or 6. I haven't seen a negative portrayal since then. My understanding is that Brad Pitt can't sell a movie in China because 7 years in Tibet back in 1997. Elite capture is billions of dollars flowing into our campuses, which was recently documented by the Wall Street Journal. Some of that has hiring requirements attached to it. Some of it has cultural agreements attached to it. Elite capture is, with some of the folks in the crowd, we found that Kansas State has dozens of research agreements with Chinese military entities in China. And so elite capture is a way to grab public opinion from the top, I would say, so that when Disney makes a movie in Xinjiang, where the United States says a genocide is currently occurring, Disney is not going to want to promote that narrative on news channels that they control. There's a genocide going on, and we just made a movie there, and we used some of that labor. So that's elite capture, is you trick Americans into silence, or you induce them through economic means. And one last example, down here in Texas, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, he put out a tweet where he basically said, democracy's good for Hong Kong. And this was an example of killing the chicken to scare the monkeys. So killing the chicken, you make an example with a huge punishment of one actor so that everybody else gets the message. And so China is demanding that this guy be fired. They're threatening to kick the NBA out of China. Maybe they did for a couple years. It wasn't just the NBA that got that message. Hollywood got that message. Every university got that message. Folks in DC. Elite capture is the select committee had to secretly run that TikTok bill out of committee without anyone in the public knowing about it. This is the bill to force TikTok to divest. No one knew that bill was in the works until it went out of committee 50-0, because TikTok's lobbying power in DC is so overwhelming that if they get a whisper of that, they could kill it before it gets public.
So I'm going to take what Michael said and I'm going to raise it one more notch. So the reason why I think this competition with China is so existential and is so different from other competitions that we've faced, yes, the Soviets had spies at the State Department. What they did not have was they did not have senior US government officials who owed their livelihoods to having done billions of dollars in business with China. They did not have people at the highest levels of Wall Street who could call the President of the United States the day before he would sign an executive order and try and personally lobby him to go soft on China. Now, to President Trump's credit, he never did that. But you had cabinet secretaries, you had senior people in the administration who had made fortunes from doing business in China. That is elite capture at an extraordinary level. It's been a 30-year process, and it is unlike anything we've ever faced. It makes, Alger Hiss look like child's play. And I think the difference between that and what we see in places in the global south, I used to run the Pacific Islands for the NSC. They'd give suitcases of cash to, local legislators in the Solomon Islands. That is, that's par for the course. What we're talking about is global billions of dollars of cash flowing into people's pockets, and it is a level of influence and access that is hard to fathom.
Governor Ducey, how does this manifest itself for a governor or elected officials? You have all this pressure to create jobs, to get a new factory to locate. You have trade delegations. You have things like the Confucius Institutes, which are not as much of a problem. I'm sure that there were some. You have like sister city arrangements in Arizona. How much of this did you become aware of as you became governor, and what was your reaction when you began to understand what was going on?
Well, I would actually take what Alex and Michael said and call them and actually raise this even more.
Please.
Because if you look at our Fortune 500 companies and the size of the trading component that we have with China, it's our companies that have financed this, have undergirded their economy. So it's not just the elites. I imagine many of these CEOs are probably flag-waving, patriotic Americans, but their shareholders and employees are now contingent on this relationship, and it's all been done, we've volunteered it. So at the state level, as we became aware, of course, it was something we wanted to know more about, because this is something I think that you traditionally think of geopolitically, that this is done out of Washington, D.C. with the FBI and the CIA, and the first canary in the coal mine at the state level were these Confucius Institutes. And it might be one of the large mistakes that China made, because it was such an open and easy target. And you have many of our university presidents looking for these foreign exchange programs, oftentimes with the best of intentions. But it was just a clear path for our universities to be infiltrated, for some of these people from around the world to be educated, and we don't necessarily know the damage that's been done. Now, we've been able to shut down these Confucius Institutes, but it's what is there beyond that, and what kind of intelligence do we have on the people that are in the foreign exchange part of the community? I think you've seen, and I give a lot of credit to Robert O'Brien and Mike Pompeo, and you have to say that Donald Trump was the first administration to call this out, because since Richard Nixon, we've thought, not all of us, but some of us thought that these will be our trading partners, they will become our friends, and we'll see liberalization over time. Well, that was never their intent, and now that's clear for us to see and to act on. And I think part of the discussion here today, and that Michael and I and Alex are going to continue tomorrow, is what can happen at the state level. Because I think much of this is being done well beneath the radar. And if our governors are aware of this, there's a lot of policy that can take place to combat this.
Alex, there's been a little bit of discussion about the intellectual property thievery, but I'd like you, if you can, and perhaps a follow-up from Michael, explain to the audience about China's national security law, which requires all citizens of the People's Republic of China to, at any time, upon request by the Chinese Communist Party, to conduct any sorts of acts of espionage on behalf of the state. And then, if you can, link that, if you will, with the secret police stations that we keep uncovering in America as well as around Europe. Although I know in other places, for example, in Hungary, they just opened them with open arms widely, just said, come on into Hungary and open up a secret police station where you're welcome. But tell us about that aspect of their how they conduct business.
Well, I used to tell this to when the American chambers from Beijing or Shanghai would come to the White House. I would try and walk them through this from a macro perspective, and fortunately, it was usually just met with deaf ears. But look, the Chinese have a strategy. It was made in China 2025, and there'll be successor documents. And this is, what are the industries that they have to capture for their holistic national power, their conception of what will make them a great power on par with and eventually just to supersede the United States. AI and shipbuilding, and you go down the list of autonomy, all these things. They have a national security law that, in order to achieve those goals, deputizes every single CCP, every single Chinese citizen, to go and be an intelligence gatherer to give the trade secrets and the intellectual property that they can obtain to the state to meet those requirements. And more than that, it makes you in violation of the law if you have the opportunity to do that and you don't take it. So you will actually be held responsible by the Chinese state if you have a chance to steal IP from a foreign-owned entity and you don't take it. They have created an incentive structure that I think has made it impossible. And this is what I've tried to tell American businesses since I was in government. I think, unfortunately, with limited success. There is an absolute incentive structure that the CCP has created to prey upon American commerce and foreign commerce. And the purpose of that is they view this as zero sum. We lose, they win. That's how they see it. This is not a mutual advantage. This is not kind of a traditional economic model. Now, to your point, Chuck, about the police stations, they believe that every Han Chinese, regardless of whether you were born in the United States, whether you were born in Australia or New Zealand, whether you could have been outside of mainland China for 5 generations, they believe that you are a subject of the Chinese Communist Party. And these secret police stations, in addition to attempting to get more intellectual property, are also a part of the CCP's objective of control and aggressive overseas intelligence gathering and suppression of what they view as a universe of people who ultimately owe their allegiance to them. And we've seen this in New Zealand and Australia, where they have harassed students on campuses. They have openly attacked Tibet flag protesters with Tibetan flags. They've just had Ministry of State Security thugs beat them in public. They don't view borders as any impediment to their political control or their attempt to get intellectual property.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I would add when the leader of China visited San Francisco, I believe it was November of last year, there were a number of Chinese Americans who took to the streets to protest that. And those Chinese Americans were beaten in the streets. It is San Francisco, but as I say, it's still the United States of America. What we say, and we deal with this issue frequently because we work with a lot of legislatures to advance policies, state legislatures, and there's often an accusation of xenophobia, racism, whatever you'd want to call it. And as a starting fact of the matter, the Chinese people themselves, as just explained by Alex, but the Chinese people themselves are the first and greatest victims of the Communist Party. Whatever the Communist Party will end up getting over the line in damaging America, and they've done a lot already. We could just talk about fentanyl, all these people dying of this poison. Whatever they do to America, they've done 10x worse to their own people. So the Chinese people themselves are subjugated to these crazy laws that say if you're not stealing from America, you're violating some Chinese law. The average Chinese person doesn't want anything to do with this, but they live in essentially a police state. They don't have a choice. And so when we see a lot of Chinese coming across the border, I would be doing the same thing too. But at the same time, we have to be really careful about who's coming in. And at a macro level, because we're talking about all these threats, this infiltration, and why has this happened? How has this been allowed? I think that, as Alex pointed out, they exploit our weaknesses. But one of our weaknesses, so to speak, is our openness, which we actually know is a tremendous strength. The openness of America, the country of immigrants, taking all the talent from the world, housing it here, leveraging it, creating amazing things, amazing country, best model for any country ever. That does have a soft underbelly of not being as careful as we should be. And we've had the luxury of being so tremendously powerful militarily and economically that we really couldn't imagine that some foreign power would want to do things like this to us, nor would they even really dare to do so. But we now know that this foreign power does want to do those things to us and is doing those things to us. So while we should absolutely maintain our tremendous sort of beacon of light image, and we should attract the immigrants and the engineers who are going to build those technologies that let America win, that drive America to victory, at the same time, as is in our name of state armor, we do also at the same time have to put on our armor, be a little bit more protective, or maybe a lot more protective than we've been over the last couple decades.
Governor Ducey, let's shift gears a little bit and maybe get a little optimistic, a little upbeat. As chief executive of one of the largest states in the nation, as I recall, Arizona's in the top 10. You have a fair amount of power, including a bully pulpit that you could employ. Currently, China's shipbuilding capacity is about 200 times that of America. Currently, as I recall, about 90% of the world's advanced microcircuits are made in Taiwan, within 90 miles of the People's Republic of China. Currently, the vast majority of our pharmaceutical basic ingredients are made in China. Currently, the large transformers that carry 70% of our electricity are mostly made overseas, the plurality made in China. But governors can affect economic policy. I know there's been a long debate within right-of-center circles as to just how much laissez-faire we should be versus how much there should be a little bit more deliberation. But what is it that governors in states can do to begin to address these dangerous gaps? Because I understand, didn't you have some success in the silicon, the chip manufacturing world?
Well, there has been a real wake-up call, and I think you would see the discussion different among the governors today than you would have, say, 5 years ago. One thing Arizona is very proud of is we were able to win the Taiwan semiconductor competition among all of the 50 states, where Taiwan Semiconductor decided to build its American outlet and headquarters in the state of Arizona. And I was in a lot of economic development competitions against Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis, Bill Haslam, and Bill Lee in Tennessee. This is one that involved not only all of the governors as a real cherry on top of the sundae, so to speak, but it also involved Mike Pompeo into the negotiations as Secretary of State. Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, was in on these negotiations, and so was Wilbur Ross. So now we are going to have this footprint of what might be the most valuable company in the world geopolitically and serve as a deterrent, because what China wants is not necessarily the buildings of Taiwan Semiconductor. They want the brain power and the IT and the technology. And so now you have some redundancy around this project in a company that's investing heavily in Arizona. But it remains complex because China is also an incredibly large consumer of these chips. We were talking earlier at the Cicero Institute about silver linings during COVID-19, and I think that school choice and universal ESAs really came out of the way many of the teachers' unions handled the shutdown of public schools. I also think there was a silver lining from COVID on what we saw around the supply chain. And we saw the bad actor China would be in this setting, the leverage that they had. So I think this discussion around laissez-faire and free trade is going to remain. I'm leading a new organization called Citizens for Free Enterprise, and this is something that we definitely want to take on. But we should be doing the free trading with our friends and allies, and certainly not with our adversaries, opponents, and enemies. And if there's one thing we learned, and this really did begin with Reagan talking about the importance of North American free trade, and I think it was improved under Donald Trump with the USMCA. I always wanted a company, when I was talking to them, to come to Arizona. I didn't care where in Arizona, I just wanted them to pick Arizona. If they didn't pick Arizona, well, then I prefer they choose one of the other 49 states. But I think that this allows us to build stronger relationships with our allies, because if it's not one of the other 49 states, Canada or Mexico or Central America or South America, we should secure our supply chains, and we should reward our allies. And I think that this is the way forward, is to see the world through that prism of who are our allies and then who are our opponents.
Let's talk for a moment about civil defense, and then I think we're going to end up going to questions here soon. The federal government had a pretty robust civil defense program from World War II up through probably the late 70s and early 80s, when things started to get politicized and people kind of had this attitude that the left promoted that, well, what's the point? Everyone's going to die in a nuclear war anyway. Now, interesting why they said this, of course, the old Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China invested huge sums of money in precisely the expectation of trying to survive a nuclear war. So there was clearly a different attitude about it. So today, you don't see the federal government really doing anything when it comes to civil defense. And yet, as we've now discovered, if China were to cut off the key starting ingredients for pharmaceuticals, you could potentially have hundreds of thousands of Americans dying because they can't get access to antibiotics or to blood pressure medicine or their diabetes medicine. Similarly, with the electrical grid, my understanding now is that it takes a 4-year backlog to get a high voltage transformer from China just to connect a power plant to the grid, much less what we would do if a bunch of them were damaged. So what role do you see for states to fill the gap left by the federal government when it comes to basic civil defense?
So I think we have to start with the premise, I touched on this briefly earlier, that in the event of a conflict with China, the U.S. homeland is going to be a battlefield. What that looks like, I think, is unclear, and we can only speculate. But if we read Chinese doctrine, we read them in their own words, we listen to what the People's Liberation Army talked about this in the late 90s. I mean, this is not a new concept for them. And they don't view there to be some sort of delineation between the theater of conflict and the continental United States. To them, it's a weakness, and they want to find a way to exploit the weakness and the vulnerability. The states, whether it's the National Guard, whether it's civil local law enforcement, paramedics, whatever it may be, you're going to have a response at the state level, because the federal government is going to be overwhelmed dealing with a conflict that it has never dealt with since 1945. And so I think we have to start, and this is what I love about what Michael's doing, trying to change the thought process, where it's not just the specific policies that we're going to be promoting, it's the paradigm. The paradigm can't be this 1990s one where, well, these things go on in the Middle East and they go on in East Asia, and we just watch it on our TVs at home here. That's not how this is going to work. And so having folks at those different tiers, that municipal, county, state level, who are able to start thinking, hey, I have a role in this. As a governor, I have a role. As a mayor, I have a role. As a county commissioner, I have a role. I think that's going to be a paradigm shift. And from there, we need to come up, as Chuck said, that leads to a robust conception of civil defense, because this thing isn't going to stop at the Taiwan Strait.
All right, now is the time for Q&A. And so while you're thinking of your excellent question, we have had questions that have been texted in to me from the great beyond. And so I'm going to prime it with a question to Governor Ducey. And when you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and then tell us who you are, give us your name, and then ask a question. Don't give us a speech, because that's our job up here, okay? I'll get jealous. So the question to Governor Ducey has to do with Biden's tariffs on electric vehicle imports from China. Is this good foreign and or economic policy? Will China be seriously impacted by it at all?
I think this idea of what President Biden has discussed on tariffs on electric vehicles has to look be seen through both an economic policy spectrum, but also a national security spectrum. And that's what I'm talking about here is if we're talking about changing the paradigm, I think we're going to have one consistent message from the President of the United States through to the governors. And I think the people in this room are probably much better educated on this issue right now than many policy leaders around the country. I mean, this is something that in many ways, I hate to say this, we've been asleep at the switch. And the relationships and the trade missions and the academic exchanges have now been going on for decades. I remember where I was when Mike Pompeo gave that speech at the National Governors Association. And if you recall, he came in hot in terms of what was going on. And I could sense the eye rolls from my Democratic counterparts around the room. So I think this idea, I've a little concerned, do we need any more electric vehicles right now in the United States? The appetite for buying these things has seemed to slow dramatically. And I think this is an opportunity for the administration to educate the electorate on what is happening geopolitically from a national defense standpoint, and then to talk about what trade policy should be to benefit our country and our friends.
All right, the first question looks like we have near the back, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the green shirt.
Good afternoon or early evening, gentlemen. Thanks for coming. My name is Jason Brecht. I'm from Round Rock. The concept of elite capture was new to me today. I hadn't heard of that terminology, and I didn't like where it went. And you said it was, Mr. Gray said not to make you alarmist, but I'm a little bit alarmed. So isn't that more bribery at best and treason at worst?
Well, look, it depends on how far it's taken, and it depends on how it manifests itself. I think what has most been prevalent, and this is a bipartisan phenomenon, is you have very wealthy people who made a lot of money. As a friend of mine said, China bought a lot of houses in the Hamptons for 30 years. And a lot of people made a lot of money in China, and it colors your views. Some of this is, I think, very deliberate, and they're making policy choices and recommendations based on their pecuniary interest. Other times, I think it's an implicit bias. And I certainly know that I serve with people who worked in the financial industry and are patriots and had nothing but the best interests of the United States at heart. And they came down on a different side than I did on a lot of the China questions. And I think part of that is probably just an implicit bias from their experience of doing very well in China. So I don't want to cast broad aspersions on people, but what I will say is, if we are thinking about a path forward for how to deal with China, I think we need to, and this is something that I hope future presidents are very aware of, we need to be very aware of people's backgrounds in the context of their professional experience and how that relates to their ability to deal with the economic and national security threats of China. When the president is interviewing someone for a senior role, I hope a question, regardless of who the president is, I hope one of the questions that gets asked is, are you comfortable pursuing policies that have a negative impact on the economic relationship between the United States and China? I hope that question gets asked, because I think there are plenty of people who've served in government in the last 30 years who would not be comfortable answering that question in the negative.
So just to add a little more to that, a number of years ago, there was a fascinating study done with Boeing. And as it turns out, Boeing wanted to sell a lot of commercial aircraft to China. And here's Boeing, also a big defense contractor. And we come to find out that Boeing lobbyists were blanketing Washington, D.C. to make sure that trade terms with China would be as favorable as possible, because they knew that if they didn't do everything they could, they'd sell fewer aircraft and Airbus would sell more aircraft. And so they were just looking out for their interests. And the big difference is that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't make anything we really wanted, not in quantity, maybe a little bit of vodka, a little bit of caviar, right? And that was about it. And so the nature of the threat from the old Soviet Union was you had a few people who were actual Marxists and communists who looked to the Internationale or look to Moscow for leadership, that was a teeny tiny fraction of people, right? Now you have much broader population of people who have been touched by Beijing and have made a lot of money. And that's a massive difference. The gentleman in green, and then I think we may have some questions over here.
Hello, my name is Andre Burnell. You've mentioned semiconductors and intellectual property, so I'd like to just focus on semiconductors. And the question is this. Domestically, we have a program called Trusted Foundry, which is to make sure that the semiconductors manufactured in the U.S., such as by TSMC, et cetera, if they're not U.S. owned, aren't compromised by spies. So I'm interested if you have any thoughts or comments on Trusted Foundries. And then internationally, the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an export control arrangement, it's not a treaty, is voluntary, and Russia's a member, right? And it's collapsed. And so the question is, do you see anything coming out of the Wassenaar Arrangement where maybe, and there was a reference of working with our friends, maybe there's something that we can do with certain friendly countries on export controls for semiconductors, but technology in general.
Just on the Trusted Foundries, we have a huge kind of failure of imagination as a general matter with the defense industrial base. We let our defense industrial base get hollowed out for 30 years, and it was connected to the broader destruction of the manufacturing sector. I would argue it was intentional and it was done by China, and we had a bipartisan failure to stop that. I think Trusted Foundries, I used to deal with that a lot more. I haven't been involved in 6 years. I would just say I think it's well-intentioned. Like any effort, there's some things that probably could be done better, but we have to start looking at, one, rebuilding manufacturing and industrial base, and that's going to, I think, bring us into industrial policy sometimes in areas that make us reflexively uncomfortable as people from a free market perspective. But from a defense perspective, sometimes it's just going to have to be done. And the second is with things like critical minerals, semiconductors, Trusted Foundries, we have to make sure that these things are actually producing the outcome that were the taxpayers intending them to produce. Trusted Foundries, when I was involved, was still kind of nascent, and so I think we've at least then we had a ways to go. I hope it's progressed a little bit.
All right, we have a question over here.
Tim Von Dolan from Austin. Going back to the illegal immigration issues, are you aware of any entity that's taken it upon themselves to, let's say, under the radar, seek to meet and interview a number of these people who have been crossing the border, whether it be male or female, for the purpose of trying to establish purpose, even if our immigration services are not going to do that? Is there somebody trying to find out who and what countries are trying to influence things happening in the United States in the future?
Anyone want to take that question?
Just to start on that, I'm actually aware of an article written by Chuck DeVore in the last week, I think, where apparently we have reduced the number of questions asked of Chinese nationals crossing the border from something like 45 to 5. So it's a very strange conversation, for the head of DHS to be saying, looks like there's a flood of foreign nationals coming from an adversarial nation. Of course, I would assume most of them are refugees of some sort, but then DHS says, let's cut the red tape for this, let's get them in as quickly as possible. Like, this is the one area where they seem to want to cut the red tape. I don't know if there's someone outside of an official government trying to document that. I know in Texas there's pretty protective laws about that. I will mention kind of one friend of ours who's an investigative journalist up in Maine, who's investigated a string of literally hundreds of illegal marijuana farms run by triad drug cartels. And so that is, a citizen journalist investigating that. They've kind of unwound some of the layers of that, but it's a triad drug cartel connected to the Communist Party, and they seemingly traffic most of the marijuana that gets sold into the city of New York, state of New York, and then they filter those profits into all sorts of other illicit activities. So that's all I'm aware of is sort of citizen journalism efforts to figure out some of where these people crossing the borders are going. And I do think that some of the laborers up in Maine they're in the country illegally.
Please.
Traditionally, those statistics are held by the Department of Homeland Security and the good people at the Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And it's really hard to describe how overwhelmed these forces are. And these are good people. You don't sign up to be on the Border Patrol because you want to process illegal migrants or you want to change diapers in some of this temporary housing. But this is what these men and women are doing right now on our southern border. So there would be no statistics that would be reliable from the federal government over the last 3 years. And I don't know that there's any entity, any news organization, any citizen organization that could possibly accurately document this. This is something where I think you just have to believe your eyes. And I know you know this in Texas, but in so many ways, all 50 of our states today are border states because they are at least being affected by this fentanyl invasion that's taken lives in so many high schools and college campuses. And then what happens beyond that, we're yet to know.
We have time for one quick question to answer, and one of our viewers online said they saw someone's ID or a credit card over here somewhere, so you might want to look over there. Sir.
Hello, I'm Jeff, and just curious if you think that the storm is growing in strength, because there's this paper tiger theory out there that the demographics of China, the aging population, the economic vulnerabilities of an economy based on high volume, low margin, do you feel like the threat is growing, or do you feel like there's this convergence where those vulnerabilities in China actually make us more likely to come into some, this plan come to, more vulnerability to the U.S.?
Right. So China is growing old before they've grown rich. They're based on an export economy. They've put a lot of money into their military buildup, but they can't sustain it. Who wants to take the doom, the last question that looks at the potential for doom?
So the CCP, since the Deng Xiaoping era, was built on the idea that you don't get any political freedom as a Chinese citizen, but what you do get is a rising standard of living. You get 10% economic growth a year, and you get a chance to be in the middle class. That's gone. Xi Jinping has destroyed their economy through his own policy choices and for 4 decades of CCP demographic policy choices. Now, what are they left with? They are left with no political freedom, no economic growth, a young population that's dreams have been shattered, and the only thing that the CCP can do to regain its legitimacy is to create some sort of overseas crisis. What can they do except try and bring the great China dream of reunifying and rectifying the century of humiliation? That's all he has left. And so I think this is why the Davidson window of 2027, the idea that Taiwan is going to be under the gun by 2027, I actually think that may be, we may be much closer to it than 2027, because the demographic and economic forces are forcing their hand a lot faster than that original assessment.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we held today's panel, because I think it's very important to have these sorts of discussions, because we're not getting it from this White House, we're certainly not getting it from this administration, and the media certainly doesn't want to broadcast much of what goes on in terms of the debate in our Congress when these matters are discussed. So I hope you come away from this a bit more informed, a bit more resolute to take on some of these challenges, and hopefully a little bit more heartened by the fact that there are, in fact, solutions and people working on them. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate your attendance here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for this panel on the threat from China.